I was out of breath. Running out of the back screen porch, I sprinted across my yard, the bag on my back bouncing to and fro with every step. I continued running, picking up speed across the cement walkway around the pool, and then through the thick and overgrown grass of my backyard. I jumped headlong into the thick brush of the forest. That was only a few yards wide, separating Mrs. Jan's yard from my own, and Butch's eager yelping encouraged my exit from the tree lining. The thick-set pit bull ran along my side, excited at the frantic pace I was running, and together we made our way to the side of the road, before Butch's chain pulled back on his neck, preventing him from getting any further away from his doggy house. Mrs. Jankowski was on her porch, watching with a smile as I ran across her yard. "Running late, Derek?" she asked in her sweet old lady tone. "Yes," I said, panting out of breath, as I sat down next to the pavement, looking down the road for a high-speeding bus, which usually arrived at this time. "I didn't see it go by yet," Mrs. Jan had said, resting my nerves. I wiped my hand across my upper brow, gathering the slick sweat onto my hand and flicking it off to my side. Butch and I waited by the side of the road for several additional minutes before I looked back at my house, wondering if I had missed the bus. I began contemplating what I was going to say to my sister, who would be forced to drive me to school, and while hounding me with irritated remarks the entire way. Mrs. Jankowski came down from her front stoop, remarking how it was unusual for the bus to be so late, and she nurtured my downtime with a long and engaging story of her days as a little girl, and how she had to walk to school every day, regardless of the weather conditions, in a long-skirted dress that was required for all girls of that era to wear. While I sat there conjuring black and white images of what the old days must have been like, based on Mrs. Jan's description, I had realized a small shiver of excitement tugged at my attention. I was really looking forward to going to school. I felt like I was hopped up on caffeine, despite having trekked across the town the previous night, and I was very eager to meet with Miss Kendleton today. I sure had a story to tell her. I wasn't sure how she was going to take it, but I felt she would be open to hear it. She always was. Her endless pursuit to try and comfort me in the conversation had finally worked, and I was now willing to tell her it all. She was the only one who would truly listen to this kind of stuff. The bus was coming down the road. It was a strange sight, as the small yellow student transporter rode carefully to my position, on the correct side of the road, obeying the speed limit to the very decibel. It was Betty, all right. That I could tell, as sand granulars were wedged into the front grills of the bus, and the shedding paint shards were leaving behind a fluttering paper trail. I subconsciously stepped back from the road, as I was used to a gusting wind that threatened to pull me under the bus in its sudden arrival. That, however, didn't happen this time. The doors parted, revealing the long 3 steps that led into the bus, with the driver seated in an old, torn-up chair, right behind the helm-sized steering wheel that only the long, lengthy arms of Grover could properly spin. The bus driver had neatly combed back hair that shined as though it was glazed over with a half bottle of gel. The receding hairline was carefully covered over with the hair from the side of his head, and a nifty, old-school, wide-eyed set of sunglasses sat snugly on a long nose, reflecting my image. Mud-covered ex-military boots were clapped down onto the bus's floor as a reaching hand extended towards the door, welcoming me aboard. "Welcome aboard, partner," Grover shouted, as I stepped back in shock at Grover's new appearance. His grizzly beard had recently been shaved, and his words were spoken in clear enunciation, a most uncommon trait for Grover. As I climbed aboard, Mrs. Jankowski said goodbye, and at the sound of her voice, Grover curved his long head around to try and score a look behind me. He swiftly took his glasses off his face and corked his nose at the woman he saw. He grabbed onto my arm, pulling me towards him as his eyes were busy looking outside the open doorway. "Who's that pretty lady out there, lad?" whispered Grover, as he smiled when Mrs. Jankowski returned a romantic look back at him. Was all I could get out before I had to jump out of the firing line of transferring currents of affection that were exchanged between the two elderly folk. It was a strange sensation to both feel and see the new side of Grover, and his now clear and coherent thoughts were dead focused on the older lady who had been my neighbor all throughout my life. This was going to take some time getting used to. I was galloping down the hallway. A group of 8th graders were before me, and I stopped to compose myself. Throwing my chest out as I tried to maintain a masculine look, my excitement to meet with Miss Kendleton was hard to control, and after passing the upperclassmen who were too focused on shoving one another into lockers, I picked up my step and ran off towards the counselor's office. Last night's little adventure was being replayed in my mind. It was a tale I was intending to share. Grover's new appearance that early morning had brought certainty to my belief that whatever it was I had done in that strange, unusual dream state had actually brought a resolution to this world. Grover had changed, exactly as I had intended, and as awkward as his new behavior was, to be attracted to my old, grandmotherly neighbor, it was a better outcome than the road he was previously heading down. I had cured him. The long pending question was dawning upon an answer, and that was what I really needed. There was a meaning to things now, and I knew I could change it for the better. I wanted to share this moment with Miss Kendleton, hear her take on it, as I knew she would understand. After all, I had shown it all to her before. The halls were slowly emptying as the transition from classes were coming to an end, and students had to make their way to their designated course or face the consequences of being tardy. I originally had Mrs. Peterson's class at this hour, but my convenient meetings with Miss Kendleton happened to be during her class, which I admit was entirely orchestrated by me. The counselor's offices were slightly out of the way of the 6th grade classrooms, which made for a longer trip, but I enjoyed the leisure time of strolling through empty corridors with a purpose. I felt important, as any time a dutiful hall monitor stopped me in my tracks and demanded to know where I was heading, I would cast them aside with an open palm, saying I had a scheduled meeting with a counselor. Nobody would get in the way of that. The guidance counselors were the commanding power of the school, and nobody could stop a student from meeting with them. The door to the office was a traditional blondish wooden door that had a welcoming appeal, unlike the heavy, thin-windowed metallic doors that encased students into the academic classrooms. Even the interior seemed out of place among the cold stone foundation of the school, as floors had short-haired rugs and white dry-boarded walls that made for a more roomy atmosphere. The warm comfort of the room, however, was not there, and I felt an eerie awkwardness lingering in the air. My pace slowed down as I closed in on the door and looked at the hunchback secretary whose nose was buried deep in a literature book, minding no attention to my entry. I strode past the comfortable waiting chairs and towards Miss Kendleton's office, which had a closed door, an uncommon trait for her. Maybe she had another student with her? I went to peek into the window when the secretary looked up and spoke to me. "She is sick today," said the hunchback, looking immediately back down into her book. "Oh," I had remarked quietly, looking back at the office door as though skeptical of her words. Something told me it wasn't exactly as she said it was. The secretary didn't know the specifics, but sick was just a mild way of putting it. She had heard rumors, stories, things that said Miss Kendleton might not just be out because of a cold, or some other common ailment we all have to face. I walked out of the office, disappointed that I wasn't able to speak with Miss Kendleton, and even more disappointed that I had to go to Mrs. Peterson's class. I spent my time walking through the halls, avoiding the hall monitor's common routes, and dreading the idea of sitting in Mrs. Peterson's specifically assigned seat for me. Worse to the matter was that I didn't do the homework I was supposed to, but I kept my mind on the clocks in the hallways, making sure that I was late enough to avoid that first few minutes of class when she collected everybody's sheets and stared down any student who didn't hand in anything. When I went in, there was no seat. I stopped at the door entrance, feeling awkwardly out of place as I interrupted one of Mrs. Peterson's lectures. Realizing my assigned seat wasn't in the corner of the class, I reached out nervously with my mind, asking where it was Mrs. Peterson expected me to sit. She looked at me, but she didn't appear the way I had expected. Behind her eyes were only sympathy and a strange sense of understanding. She knew I was late because I was originally supposed to meet with Miss Kendleton, and she was well aware of her absence, and that I was bound to return to class, after having found out she wasn't in today. I was expected to be late, but a strange sense of remorse flooded her emotional centers as she repressed a conversation she had heard earlier in the day regarding Miss Kendleton's alleged sickness. I sat in the seat nearest to the door, avoiding an awkward trip across the classroom, knowing it'd be all right with Mrs. Peterson, as she had an unusual elastic forgiveness for my interruption. She continued with her class, refusing to look over in my direction, as she feared reminding herself of the dreadful news from the morning. It was getting easier. The familiar sensations of vibrations climbed throughout my body. The walls shifted, and the floor fell out below me, replacing it with my intended designation. I didn't know where I wanted to go, only knew who I wanted to see. Bronze walls stretched out a great distance to my sides as a golden hue lit the vast cathedral roof, from candles that hung off the large 8-sided pillars that aligned the center corridor. Dim stained glass windows painted the great walls of the ark, and narrow streams of moonlight shot through their rectangular panes, lighting the center lane in a bluish tint. It reminded me of a church, but unlike one, no deity was worshipped here, and there was no grotesque depiction of a dying man stapled to the top of a focal point. Down the long carpeted lane was a man, seated in cross-legged fashion, facing a bronze statue that was the depiction of another human being, seated in the same position as him. I had finally found him. My ghostly form floated over to where the man was seated. I circled him, looking down upon his blank face that was tilted slightly downward, as though tired from his long and still pose. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was controlled as his arms rested firmly on his legs, with his forefingers pressed lightly to their corresponding thumbs. It was all so ritualistic and seemingly unnecessary to me. "It is you again," he spoke, quietly, his heart rate picking up and a sense of unease threatening to take control of his disciplined state. I did not respond. As though I was just an invisible observer, I continued to encircle him, slowly moving closer to that I could look into his face, that I might better recall his image for future circumstances, had I the need to ever find him again. This was him, I assured myself, the man I had seen twice before, the Golden Warrior. "Why do you come to me, entity?" The man spoke quietly, composing himself in a meditative state. I'm not an entity," I said, confused by his words. "I'm Derek." The man opened his eyes. He looked up at me with an expression of shock before he shot his eyes away, looking into the palms of his hands with another well-practiced ritual that told him what state of living he was in. "I'm dreaming," he said aloud. "Me too," I said back. "Are you really a boy?" he asked, slowly rising from the ground, expecting an answer laced in deceit. "I guess," I said, looking around observantly at the strange interior of the temple. My answer didn't provide him with any comfort. I tried looking out the windows to see what was outside of the temple, but there was nothing but the blur of high winds as though the building was in flight, high into the clouds. "How is this world so stable?" the man asked, looking back into his hands as though confused over the idea that they appeared so real. "How can you do this?" I wasn't sure if the question was from me. I sat back quietly, watching as the warrior performed an unusual array of movements that brought him greater comfort and lowered his aggressive disposition to me. "Why do you come here?" he asked. I don't know," I admitted. "I saw you before. You helped me from those things," I said, trying to recall the imagery, but stopped myself short as the world around me fought to reform into the recollection of the horrible world. "I heard your call," he said, looking off at the bronze statue of a man meditating. "It was very loud, like an infant's cry. I thought somebody had needed help." He paused for a moment, looking back at me as though denying my physical appearance. "You didn't need my help at all. You consorted with that creature, that woman. Who is she?" "My mother." "She is no mother, besides a mother to misery. Why did you consort with her? Did you know what you were doing?" the man asked, growing aggravated as he recalled the event, specifically of me speaking to her. He felt as though it was wrong, and all his life's work was devoted to avoid such circumstances, to deter mankind from such actions. "Why do you say that?" I had shouted, as I was shaken by his words and his negative opinion of her. The walls of the temple trembled at my voice, and the warrior looked around him, well aware of my influence to the world around us. "Okay," he said, lowering his hands in a gesture. "Just relax," he asked, afraid of sparking off any emotion again. He approached me apprehensively, expecting me to leap at him at any moment, and circled around me, looking at me from every angle as though looking for something to be out of place. "You really are innocent, aren't you? You are completely unaware." I just looked at him in confusion. Your eyes, he looked closely into me. Are they really like that? I figured it was some sick mockery of man, made by a spirit talented in the arts of mimicry. I mean, really, 2 different colors. I guess it's not all that uncommon. I was born that way, I told him, looking away as I didn't like anyone staring at me with such intensity. My human-like reaction made him feel apologetic over his previous assumptions of me. Your power in the astral. I had seen it. That is not something you are born with. You freed that world. You summoned a demon. You consorted with that wretched woman. Stop! I shouted at him. Gold monuments fell from the roof as though a violent earthquake was taking place. She is my mother, I whispered. I whimpered, turning my back in his direction, regretting that I had ever sought out the warrior. The great pillars that held up the temple creaked and moaned under pressure, and the integrity of the temple was threatening to collapse. No! He lowered his voice, tried to place a hand on my shoulder as to comfort my emotions that threatened to lay waste to his dream world of his. He recoiled at the touch as though receiving a high-voltage shock, and thought it better to avoid contact. She's not your mother. Please, listen to me. Then what is she? I asked, trying to hold back the upsetting feeling over hearing the words. She's not your mother. She is a terrible thing, and she wants only to bring misery to this world. How do I make it stop? He looked down, as though not wanting to answer the question. I know one way, but it's not going to be easy. The warrior spoke informatively as he slid his hands across his face, bracing for the final words he was going to share. It is going to require a lot of bravery on your end. I nodded solemnly, and tears fell from my eyes as I read his thoughts long before he spoke them. Grover's younger and more vibrant character had remained in the coming day, as Dylan and I both rode our way to school on the new and refurbished version of Betsy. The bus rides were, well, longer and more boring now that Grover was more prone to abiding by the suggestions of oncoming stop signs and blaring red lights. He also spent a great deal of time at my bus stop, asking long-awaited questions to me that always revolved around one particular subject matter, or rather peculiar individual, which was Mrs. Jankowski. After arriving on time to school, as opposed to early arrivals that occurred previously as a result of the senile version of Grover's driving, I was forced with the matter of scurrying directly to class. I brought my oversized textbooks, my partially chewed pencils, sheets of homework, and requisitioned packets of paper geared for future study guides along with me, even though I really wasn't going to need them anymore. I gave Mrs. Peterson my undivided attention and focused hard on her lessons, despite not ever having the need to ever recall the information. It wasn't bad for our last day together. We got along, put aside our indifference, and for one single day found ourselves in agreement. It had meant something to me, as that was my goodbye to her, even though she was entirely unaware of the fact that we would unlikely ever meet again. I walked into the guidance office again, hoping I'd get to see Miss Kendleton and possibly share a few departing words with her as well. She wasn't there, and in her place was an even younger, more freshly graduated college student who sat awkwardly in the tight confines of Miss Kendleton's office, where the new school psychologist was busy unpacking her totes of books and reference papers. When I asked where Miss Kendleton was, I got an awkward and over-formalized response back from a mindset that was too confined to the four scriptures of a how-to-explain a tough situation to a child. The young lady had said that Miss Kendleton was very sick and would unlikely be returning to work that year. She tried to introduce herself, familiar with my name and understanding the fact she was to pick up where Miss Kendleton had left off, but I put aside the greeting. I wasn't going to have the time to get to know her. Besides, her nervous mindset had spilled out the terrible, abstract details she had heard of Miss Kendleton, and her many attempts at suicide.